As a country that has its doors open to immigrants, Canada's language learning landscape is dominated by settlement language training, which is designed to address newcomers' immediate language needs and get them started with their new life in Canada. In an attempt to establish national language standards for adult immigrants to Canada, in 1992, the IRCC, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, funded a project to investigate language needs and develop a set of benchmarks that describe language development in the Canadian context. The outcome of this project is a comprehensive and detailed working document entitled Canadian Language Benchmarks 2000, ESL for Adults, which has been tested for validity against other language frameworks such as the Common European Framework of Reference and the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Languages. The document has been revised and improved several times to fine-tune the comprehensibility, clarity, consistency, and relevance of the framework. The Canadian Language Benchmarks, or CLB document, defines the 3 stages of language learning: basic, intermediate, and advanced, each with 4 levels that describe a continuum of language competencies and skills. There are performance tasks through which learners demonstrate their knowledge and abilities. The document is used as a national reference for planning and developing language instruction in different contexts, and a framework for learning, teaching, and assessing language ability for adult ESL learners in Canada. The CLB document specifies that the CLBs provide a basis for learners to plan their language learning, set or adjust goals, and monitor progress. As the national standard for describing communicative language ability, the CLB can facilitate a common understanding of learner credentials that allows a smooth transition between classes, programs, and institutions, as well as recognition by professional organizations and licensing bodies across Canada. The CLB Guiding Principles indicate that the benchmarks are competency-based, understood as what the learners can do at each level; learner-centered, meaning that the tasks and contexts are relevant and meaningful to the learner; task-based, indicating that they are real-world instances of language use; stress community, study, and work-related tasks, meaning that they reflect social contexts that fit within the learner's community, work, and study settings. It is important to note that these benchmarks are not intended to describe discrete elements of the knowledge that underlie communicative competence, such as specific grammar or vocabulary. They are not tied to any particular instructional method, and they are not planned to be assessment in themselves. Let's see how the document is organized. The document is divided into the 4 language skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and each skill is divided into 3 stages. Each stage is organized in the following manner. Profiles of ability across a stage. A profile of ability is a statement of learner characteristics for one benchmark and one language skill. I have chosen the profile of ability for the reading skill to show the information presented in the table. For each level, there are can-do statements that outline the learner's abilities at that level, a description of the text appropriate to that level, and the strengths and the weaknesses expected from the learners at that level. Profiles are presented in groups of 4 to summarize the progression of ability across one stage of the CLB. This profile page is followed by a knowledge and strategies page that includes some background knowledge and strategies that a person may need to acquire to achieve the benchmarks in a stage in one skill. These are organized according to the 5 components of language ability based on Buckman 1990 and Buckman and Palmer 1996-2010. Next, the CLB for each skill level is presented in a 2-page spread. Each benchmark includes a profile of ability, competency statements, and sample indicators of ability. Together, they make up a benchmark level for one skill. Sample tasks illustrate the competency statements in real-world context. For each language skill, there are 4 broad competency areas, each reflecting different purposes or functions of language use. I will only talk about those that are used for the reading skill. The competency areas for each skill are drawn from the following: interacting with others, communication to maintain or change interpersonal relationships and to foster social cohesion, comprehending instructions, communication to understand instructions and directions, getting things done, communication to get things done, to obtain services, to inform decisions, to persuade or to learn what others want to be done, comprehending information, communication to learn and understand information and ideas. For each competency area, there are competency statements. These are general statements of communicative language ability that include the types of tasks that may typically be associated with demonstrated ability at each benchmark. Some competency statements are followed by features of communication in square brackets. These features, such as length, audience, and complexity, apply to all of the competencies for a CLB level. Sample indicators of ability. These are example tasks for each competency area. At the end of each stage of a skill, there is a table detailing selected aspects of communication, such as length, audience, or task complexity. These aspects are believed to assist teachers and developers in identifying learner-appropriate tasks for instructional and assessment purposes. As you might have noticed, all my screenshots were from the Stage 1, CLB 1 to 4 reading pages of the document. For Stage 2, CLB 5 to 8, and Stage 3, CLB 9 to 12, the tables and their organizations are the same. I understand that this was a rather long introduction to my presentation, but I feel it was necessary to demonstrate the theoretical background of the Canadian CLBs before talking about implementing extensive reading in this context. Now, let's dive a bit deeper into this 235-page document to find out the situation of extensive reading within these 3 stages and 12 CLB levels. I started my search of the document with a PDF simple search function, which revealed 0 instances of the word combination extensive reading. This came to me as a bit of a surprise, as this document covers so many details about several aspects of the English language learning context. In my mind, extensive reading is such an important reading activity that it is impossible for it to be missing from such a key document. I tried other search words such as pleasure reading, which also yielded 0 results. And then I tried enjoyment, which finally led me to the functional knowledge section of the Stage 2 Knowledge and Strategies page. But that was it. No further explanations were given more than this simple 2-liner here. Not convinced by this superficial search of keywords, I studied the reading sections more thoroughly, this time from A to Z, to see if there was any indication of an activity or activities that resembled extensive reading in any form, perhaps using a different terminology. Several excellent reading activities were found during this review that might be considered extensive reading. For example, in Stage 1 strategic competence, there was use search engines to access information online. In CLB 3 sample tasks, we had read the first paragraph of a simple story to determine what it is about. In the CLB 4, we had 2 sample tasks. Read a short news article, print or online to get details, and use an online encyclopedia to find relevant information for a class project. In the Stage 2 section, under Functional Knowledge, I found read stories, poetry, rhymes, and newspaper and magazine articles for enjoyment and sociability. In the CLB 6 sample task, there was read a short health or business report or a current news item. For CLB 7 sample task, there was access and read coverage of a current event on several news websites to compare coverage of the event. And then in Stage 3, CLB 12, we have read idiomatic or colloquial communication on online communities to acquire knowledge of current trends and issues, as well as topics of interest that are unfamiliar and complex. Even though these activities seem to look like extensive reading, a closer analysis of the features of these activities reveals they do not really follow the basic principles of extensive reading. First, most of these activities are followed by some form of text analysis. This is either focusing on identifying the main idea of the story, reading the news to get the details, using search engines to complete some sort of classroom activity, comparing and contrasting two or more written accounts of the same story, etc. So even though the student is reading materials outside of their textbook, they are not really reading in the ER sense of the word. In other words, they are not reading quickly. They might not be enjoying it because they didn't choose the reading task. It was actually a class assignment. They might not have adequate comprehension because the passage might be linguistically challenging. Therefore, they would most probably need a dictionary to check out those new words they meet. In other words, these activities are designed for reading to learn, like aspects such as grammar, vocabulary, main ideas, or techniques and strategies such as skimming and scanning, etc., rather than learning to read, which is practicing the reading skill to obtain better fluency, comprehension, and enjoyment. I do acknowledge that both of these types of reading are necessary for a learner to become a proficient reader, and that one can barely be effective without the other. However, as we have already seen, there's plenty of reading to learn or intensive reading ideas and activities outlined in this document. But fluency building, learning to read activities are quite scarce. So the question that comes to mind is why? Why does such a comprehensive description of language abilities, competency areas, competency statements, and sample tasks lack an ER component, or other reading fluency activities for that matter? What are the reasons extensive reading has been overlooked by the developers of this framework, policymakers, course designers, and other stakeholders in the Canadian ESL context? As a teacher trainer that has also been deeply involved with the development of LINC and ESL materials, my first observation is that extensive reading seems to be rather unknown to many of those involved with ELT in Canada. There seems to be limited appreciation and motivation for extensive reading in settlement language training programs. Teachers do not practice it in their classes, and very few professional development opportunities have been available to familiarize them with how to do it. Few conference papers have addressed this topic, and not too many resources are dedicated to it. To see if this was a valid explanation, I did an online search for extensive reading programs, professional development sessions, conference talks, and basically anything extensive reading in Canada. In my quest for information, I visited the website of quite a few Canadian colleges and universities and had a look at their ESL student resources. I also checked out the websites of newcomer settlement organizations, national and provincial conference abstract booklets, and a few Canadian publisher websites. My search was by no means a comprehensive literature review, and there might have been several resources that I have missed. Be that as it may, I found very few relevant results, which goes to show how underappreciated extensive reading is in the Canadian ELT context. Among the few websites and pages that I came across during my search, the following 5 were the ones that made the most relevant references to extensive reading. In the TESOL Ontario Conference of 2010, Peters and Burgess talked about how literature circles can benefit extensive reading, critical thinking, small group discussions, and learning group work skills. Although they had referred to extensive reading, the focus of their talk was not ER. In the TESOL Ontario 2015 conference, Oxford University Press specialist Jeff Gulley talked about extensive reading programs and pointed to logistic barriers as the main challenge of implementing an extensive reading program. He suggested using digital platforms to overcome these barriers. In the February 2015 issue of the English language learning magazine Contact, Pamela Barkwell tells a story about how she implemented extensive reading in her class and the challenges she faced during the program. She mentions student cheating, instructor resistance towards certain reading materials and the number of assigned books, and negative student and instructor attitudes as the main challenges to her ER program. She also talked about social and cultural changes of our times, which have resulted in the students' lack of motivation to read for pleasure, even in their first language. Another work published in 2015 by the Bow Valley Adult Literacy and Essential Skills Research Institute provides an introduction to extensive reading by listing the characteristics of extensive reading and its benefits, such as learner autonomy, repeated exposure, increasing overall language knowledge, developing world knowledge, increasing motivation, etc. The authors used these ideas and started an ER program for adult ESL literacy learners. The result of their attempts was an impressive series of 40 readers developed for introductory to intermediate literacy learners. Finally, in September 2020, Settlement Calgary published a very short paper entitled Extensive Reading Activities. The purpose of this publication was to give a brief definition of extensive reading and to list its benefits. The article encourages teachers to use materials such as graded readers, authentic books, bilingual books, and magazines and comic books for extensive reading. The short paper ends with a few suggestions for extensive reading activities, including skimming and scanning, timed reading, summary writing after reading, and writing down new words. The scarcity of such resources and articles shows that extensive reading is not as well known in Canada as we would have liked it to be. Let's talk about some of the other possible reasons why extensive reading has not been so popular in settlement language programs in Canada. One important issue that comes up repeatedly in our conversations with teachers is the lack of sufficient class time and resources. Many LINC and ESL classes are multi-leveled and have continuous intake all year round. This means that teachers have to be prepared for a constant flux of heterogeneous level students that are newly added to a class on a daily basis and need to accommodate them so everyone is included in the learning process. This leaves teachers with no time or energy to deal with anything outside of the required curriculum. Hence, adding yet another program such as extensive reading, which is already difficult to set up, can only add to their woes. From a funder's perspective, one reason for the lack of an extensive reading element in the ESL class can be that newcomers have more immediate language needs, such as housing, banking, employment, than reading for pleasure. Other implementation issues mentioned by Renandia and others in 2020 also apply to the Canadian context. These include a lack of Canadian graded materials or resources with immigration-specific themes, slow extensive reading gains that are not instantly tangible or measurable, and the demanding principles of setting up an extensive reading program. While I do acknowledge obstacles that might have prevented curriculum designers, course planners, and teachers from implementing extensive reading in the classroom, as an instructor who has started 4 successful extensive reading programs in a large university, a high school, and 2 private language institutes, I believe an ER program does not have to be huge in order to be successful. The first issue that most teachers bring up is the lack of free or affordable reading materials. While this is true about printed books, the possibilities for virtual extensive reading are endless. Several free resources can be found on the Extensive Reading Foundation's website. These resources include graded materials and activities that can be used for almost every level of language proficiency, such as ercentral.com. Free reading materials can also be found at freegradedreaders.com, which includes a selection of readers out of copyright as well as thousands of downloadable short readings. In addition to these, there are websites that provide graded readers for an affordable monthly subscription that is negotiable depending on the number of students in a class or a school. For example, xreading.com. Another issue that is brought up, usually by higher order policymakers, is that settlement language training needs to focus on language that can help newcomers meet immediate language needs such as the ability to open a bank account, rent a house, report a broken appliance to the landlord, fill out a medical form, etc. I would like to add to this list the need to mentally and psychologically integrate and immerse in the new society as soon as possible and learn about its government, history, culture, literature, lifestyle, etc. Many of these topics are covered in intensive reading activities that prepare eligible newcomers for the Canadian citizenship test. However, I believe creating or selecting materials for extensive reading can help students choose books and articles based on their interests and obtain a deeper understanding of their new home. On the other hand, in real life, people do not necessarily read immigration-related materials every time they read, or if they read for pleasure. We all have our topic or genre preferences, so out-of-the-class reading should not be limited to a certain topic. In other words, learners should be able to choose what they want to read. We know from research that extensive reading has several benefits, such as incidental vocabulary and grammar learning, and these improvements are not necessarily tied to one single topic or genre. As mentioned earlier in my informal interviews with teachers, several complained about the lack of time. This is certainly a valid point. I've been there myself, and I agree that there might be too many unrealistic expectations from a teacher. However, teachers can use an online extensive reading program like the M-Reader to minimize their own involvement and maximize their students' autonomy, and to track the students' reading progress online without the need for writing tests, correcting papers, keeping journals and logs, and other time-consuming classroom chores. Last but not least, I believe creating motivation and willingness is the most important prerequisite to starting any new program, including extensive reading. And I believe that this has to start with higher order decision makers, such as funders, curriculum developers, and course designers. Once they are convinced of the necessity of such a program, they can encourage schools and classroom teachers to participate by offering incentives such as certificates, professional development hours, recognition awards, paid ER hours for setup and student education, and other financial awards if possible. Finally, I believe that it is extremely important to let every person involved know that although setting up and running an ER program could have its own challenges, once those challenges are faced and overcome, students and teachers can reap the benefits of their work for a whole lifetime. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you have any comments or questions, you are more than welcome to send me an email at alavisepideh@gmail.com. Thank you very much.